Okay, greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Hello, Antonio and Barry. Are you guys chilling in the chat, waiting for the show to start? Today is April 13th, 2021, and today on the show we've got Valerie Ventura, or Varla Ventura. How you doing, Varla?
I'm doing great,
I
thanks.
said Valerie. Do you get that a
Yeah,
lot?
I get called Marla more than Valerie, but I like Valerie. That's a good name.
I was trying to search it
Same
earlier, and
letter.
it kept popping up Barla Ventura, like my autocorrect kept autocorrecting to Barla. I'm thinking, what the
Barla.
heck is Barla?
That is a new one for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been called many things, but never Barla.
Well, Varla Ventura is the author of Varla Ventura's Paranormal Parlor, Ghosts, Seances, and Tales of True Hauntings, out June 2018. She is also the author of 5 other books on spooky ooky stuff, banshees, werewolves, vampires, and other creatures of the night. The book Bizarre Among the Mermaids, Beyond Bizarre, and Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings. She can often be found lurking about the deep dark woods and lakes of Minnesota on the hunt for beastly things and hidden history. And you've got an awesome website. You've got quite a bit of books. You've been on Spaced Out Radio a lot. Welcome to Conflict Radio.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I certainly hope to get this book here, Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings, at some point. I haven't gotten it yet because I've canceled my Prime, and I'm not buying anything from Prime until I get my Prime membership back. But I have this thing where I only do a certain amount of, I guess, streaming platforms at a time.
Mm.
Otherwise, I'll have like CBS and HBO Max and Prime and all of these streaming platforms that I never use. So I usually keep one or two going at a time, and when I'm done watching everything on those, I'll go back to other things.
Rotate it out. That's
Yeah.
smart.
So I want to talk to you about fairies. I have a fascination with fairies, and I truly believe that they are real beings. And I've heard some myths and stories about them myself, but you've become quite an expert on this subject, have you not?
Yeah, I mean, I think as probably as much as most people out there who've written about fairies, at least in the last maybe 30 years or so, certainly there's people who know more than I, and every culture has its experts and its stories. But I did a book about fairies. Now, actually, I have a book about banshees, werewolves, and vampires, and in that book, that's when I kind of started getting into some of the fairy and folklore, because in fact banshees kind of straddle the world of fairy and ghosts, and so to me they were sort of the gateway creature into the kingdom of the fairy. Like most children, I was always interested in fairy tales and little things that were under rocks and sort of the natural world. So I spent a lot of time in the forest as a child and was sort of exposed to a lot of some of the old fairy tales, not just the lovely ones with the, prince that rescues you, but a lot of the sort of deep, dark woods and craggy fairy rings and things like that. So that sort of started my fascination with fairies. I also had a sighting when I was a kid that I never could quite explain away, but also as you get older, sometimes you think, well, maybe that was just something I imagined as a child, which I think can be a problem actually for a lot of adults in the way that they view children and what children see, especially when it comes to the paranormal, the supernatural, or the otherworldly. We're quick to dismiss it and call it an imaginary friend. But that can be very invalidating, especially when a child's actually having those experiences. But my mother was not invalidating, in fact, quite the opposite. She wanted all the details and she fostered that sort of understanding. And I was raised not to think of these things as scary or false, but to kind of understand that there's a spiritual, mystical element to all of these other creatures. So, and then as I got older, I studied botany quite a bit. And it's interesting because I think in a way, I almost have like a botanist view of the fairy kingdom, in that it's a kingdom And then there are all these classifications of different sort of species underneath that. So, just as you might have, things in like the lily family or the solanum family, there's things that fall in the kind of more in the goblin side of things, or the domestic fairies, or the woodland fairies. So there's a classification, and I'm not alone. I didn't invent that classification. In fact, William Butler Yeats has quite a wonderful collection all about the different sort of the old Irish view of the classification of the fairy kingdom. But that's kind of how I look at it as an overview. So when I say fairy, I'm not talking about a teeny tiny little thing with beautiful gossamer wings that, sparkles at night. There are some fairies that kind of fit into that category, that sort of pixie-like category. But I'm talking about the great kingdom of fairy, which includes creepy things that crawl out from caves, and red-eyed horses and leprechauns and all kinds of things that scream and go bump in the night.
Okay, so let me back you up a minute. A minute ago, you were talking about banshees. Could you tell everybody exactly what a banshee is?
Yeah, so a banshee is basically kind of the equivalent of a warning ghost. It's usually seen it's usually seen as a woman, sometimes as sort of a ghostly specter. It can occasionally be a disembodied head, but usually it's sort of something kind of small but very female. Occasionally looks like an older woman, but frequently a lovely young woman from a distance. Then it can kind of transform. Most people hear the banshee. Some people can see and hear the banshee, but most people actually hear the banshee. And the banshee has a very mournful wail, not unlike that of Irish keening, if you've ever been to an Irish funeral, which keening is a practice of crying and mourning. And the banshee essentially, it means of the fairy mound. That's what it translates to in Old Irish. And so it's sort of a ghost-like creature, usually warning of death. This is why it is so feared. It's not something you want to hear. You do not want to hear the banshee's cry or the banshee's wail, because it usually means that someone that you love or someone nearby will soon die or fall gravely ill. And some legends call the banshee, the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth or who lost her child, and is forever looking for her baby, mourning. There are a lot of legends around that, and there are counterparts around the world. You have La Llorona in Mexico. You have there's the Lady in White, who appears in a lot of old Italian castles, and with a very similar kind of attachment to particular families, and that people will see or hear this banshee over generations, and they know that it's a warning that death is nigh.
Well, that's kind of freaky. So if I hear
it's very freaky.
If I see a floating head, and it's like an older woman, and it's yelling, then that's just bad, right? That's bad
just
for
bad,
me.
But it's usually not you. It's usually not foretelling of your own death, which is actually worse in some ways, because it sort of foretells of the death of a loved one. And that is probably why I think the banshee is one of the more terrifying creatures, because it speaks to, it does not cause death in and of itself, nor are they necessarily malevolent. It's just that it's a warning to let you know that it's coming. And that's definitely a very scary thing.
All right. So we've got a bunch of people popping in here. Barry's in here, and Antonio asked a question. He said ask later, but I might as well ask now. I just want to let you guys know that we normally have a show on Monday, but we're here on Tuesday today. Well, because this is the day that we were able to get Varla scheduled. So Antonio wants to know, what does Varla think the two green children that came out of the cave in England were, if you know of that story, that is?
I believe I do know that story. If we're talking about the same story, there's a tale of these children that sort of appeared on a farm one day, and they had very, very greenish blue skin, and they were thought to have come from the fairy kingdom. And actually, there's an old story that relates to that about a fairy flag. I find that story very interesting. I think it's been analyzed by actually people in the medical community for many years, trying to determine what could have actually medically caused these children to have had this greenish skin. It's quite an old story. It's from like, I think, 11, maybe not the 11th century, it's 12th century, and 1100s, so it's quite an old story. But the story is that there was a man, and I've heard variations, but the one that I'm thinking of is that there was a man who had a large estate but did not have any children of his own, and one day his gardener was out in the tending the grounds, and these two children just kind of arrived, and they didn't really speak English. They seemed or Irish, I suppose, at the time. They seemed to be very disoriented, and they were just very kind of otherworldly looking and sort of hungry. And anyway, he went on to actually, I think it was in England, not in Ireland. So he goes on, he nurses them, and I believe, if I remember the story right, the boy, I don't think the boy survived, but I think the girl survived and later went on to marry and have children of her own who did not have this greenish tone to their skin. But it's believed that they came from the fairy world. And what's particularly interesting to me about that is you see the cave as an entrance to the fairy kingdom over and over again. In any culture that has a very rich fairy lore, in particular about this kind of other world that exists simultaneously with our own, but has a different relationship with time, you see portals typically are either water or caves. And you see this throughout Iceland, Ireland, a lot of the Scandinavian countries, England and Scotland, where stones or caves are portals. In fact, the last time I was in Ireland, I visited 3 different caves that claim to be where the origin of Samhain or Halloween comes from. And that is the idea that these caves were sort of the portals that would open on Halloween night, and all of the spirits from the other world, which is the fairy kingdom, would come forth. And that's where the beginning of the Halloween tradition comes from. So the cave as this kind of place that fairies can come from. So that's a very interesting story. And as I said, people have been analyzing it for years. There's another story about some I think in the Appalachian, there's this sort of skin thing that happens where people can get very, very blue skin.
The blue-eyed people.
But it's not, I don't think that they have ever found a connection. Some people say, oh, well, these kids were just abandoned and they lived in this cave and they consumed a lot of arsenic or something like that would have made their skin green. But by and large, I mean, it completely fits in with so much of what people at the time certainly knew of fairy and folklore. And the man took care of them and actually raised them, and the people all kind of, looked sideways at them. But the fairy and folklore, it's just, history is rich with these stories of humans and fairies interacting. And so that is probably what's most fascinating about it. You have intermarriages, you have changelings, you have baby switching, you have all kinds of things that in some cases we can look and say, okay, well, that was a misdiagnosed disease, and we know now that that's why people were, saying that this child had, was part troll or whatever it was. But there's also this really, really in-depth connection with the fairy realm that we've had this relationship with, and that includes mermaids and selkies, and there's all kinds of beautiful songs and stories about kind of going to the fairy kingdom or falling in love with a fairy prince or a fairy princess or a mermaid and not being able to, not being able to be together because you're from two different worlds, literally.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the blue skinned people, the blue eyed people of in Georgia. We did a show on this, the Cherokee Little People.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay.
They had a war with the Cherokee, and the Cherokee actually pushed them into a cave. Eventually, that's how they won the war. They wound up beating them back and pushing them into a cave, and they disappeared forever, never to return. And the mountain, I believe it's in Georgia, is still there to this day. There's this huge rock wall around it that the Cherokee say that these little people built as their defense. It was their final defense, and they went into a cave there and disappeared forever.
And there's actually quite a few stories about little people or fairy-like folk from, all kinds of stories from indigenous Americas. And, what I think of as equivalencies around the world of everything from little kind of like hobgoblins that look after your cattle to things that wander and warn you of death and sound like a woman crying in the night. So it's very interesting when you hear other stories. And actually, I'll be honest with you, one of my favorite things is frequently, on shows like this where your audience is interactive. In fact, I have one person I need to write back to who wrote to me, and I just only saw it today, but gave me this wonderful message about sort of a warning cry that was heard in his family. Actually, it was in his family that he had married into, his in-laws' family. It was very interesting where they heard this sound. They just called it a cat cry, and it meant that someone was going to die. And I have often wondered, because just going back to banshees in particular, and maybe there's not really an answer for this, but traditionally, banshees were sort of belonged to a clan or a place, a castle, which of course, back in the day, the family would stay there. So I often wondered, are people inheriting the banshees because it's attached to their family, or are they inheriting the ability to see the second sight, to be able to detect that supernatural presence? So we'll probably never know the answer to that, right? Because we can all speculate. And many people I know with psychic abilities will say, well, I don't think it skips a generation, or my grandmother, she used to tell stories. And so a lot of us have inherited those things possibly without really knowing that or being exposed to that. But I often wonder that, especially with some of those old stories when they talk about these castles that are haunted, is the castle haunted, or are we just, able to see what's there?
Yeah. So you got to wonder, do you think that it's an interdimensional thing, or do you think that the caves could be somewhat of a way to transverse into the inner earth?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I kind of, I see them as parallel. So I see them as actually overlapping and coexisting, and just us not necessarily being able to see them always at the same time. So I guess that might fit a little bit more. It's kind of both. I see that fitting into this idea of inner dimensions, meaning kind of like parallel universes. But I also see the idea that we're all kind of existing within the same general time and space. It's just that we have a very different relationship with time and space. For example, in the fairy kingdom, time passes completely differently. Not unlike when you hear stories of people being, abducted by an alien, and then they're found wandering some country road, and they don't know how much time has passed. Just, you'll hear these stories of someone, don't ever fall asleep on a fairy mound, because you wake up and you end up in this kingdom, and it seems like a day has passed and everything's, beautiful and shiny. And in reality, weeks have gone by and you haven't actually eaten for weeks. And, everything's sort of enchanted with a glamour. which is a big part of magic. And there's a wonderful connection as well with witchcraft and witches and seers and shamans being able to connect with this other world, not just with the natural world, but with this sort of supernatural fairy kingdom.
Yeah. So I guess I just want to give a shout out to everybody in here. Is This Reality says fairies are not sweet little Twinkie fairy dust sprinklers. They are evil tricksters, and I want to get to that in a minute. But first off, everybody in here, go ahead and hit that like button because it does help the algorithm of the show get to more people so that they know that we are live right now. We're not on our normal time, and we've got quite a few people in here, but not what it normally is on a Monday and Thursday. So hit that like button. That way it can get out there and people will know that we are here. I wanted to ask you, I was talking to somebody not too long ago that told me that fairies are really the angels that didn't take sides versus when they had the God versus Lucifer war or whatever, that they're kind of neutral, therefore they were banished into the fairy kingdom. What would you think of that?
I think they were around long before the god mythology took over the general population. So
well, I had to ask the question.
I would counter with that. I mean, before the idea of God versus Lucifer and the Roman monotheistic religion came tromping through, we had the Celts who believed in fairies and the fairy queens and the rhythm of the seasons. So, you know, all these mythologies have similarities, so I'm not going to throw one out because it doesn't quite match with my own time frame of things. But I would say that fairies predate Lucifer and that whole mythology, really.
Okay.
I mean, in my opinion.
All right. So let's talk about fairies.
I'll tell you that right now. So I'll just get that out there. I don't practice Christianity, so that's
all right.
You know.
Well, I mean, it's a good answer. I had to ask the question. It's just what I was told and thought, well, I guess I'll ask my guest who's an expert on fairies.
Well, but then, you could also argue that like those things all fit into that same kind of supernatural realm. So we have different names for things, right? That like what we might call an angel, someone else might call a guardian spirit, that someone else might call a familiar. So
yeah, or a spirit guide. Yeah.
In the modern times to really look back and say, well, this is right and this is wrong, for sure. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's true. So all of the fairies, I guess you say that the leprechauns are kind of in the fairy world, and the goblins and the banshees, and it's all kind of related. Now, are the actual fairies like are they small? Like we see, like I guess with Tinkerbell, or
they're all different sizes. Just again, like just going back to that idea of sort of the plant kingdom. Think of trees and shrubs and tiny little flowers and grubby little roots. There's all different kinds of fairies, and they're different in different regions. There are certainly what are referred to as the little people, or more often referred to as the good people, and they are frequently smaller than an average human, sometimes knee height or the size of a child. You do have accounts of things like trolls that are larger. In Scandinavia, there are these very gossamery type trolls, which are very beautiful, don't quite fit the idea of what most of us consider a troll, which is kind of like a semi-gruff thing that hangs out under bridges and protects kind of entrances to caves and things like that. So you have a huge range from everything that can fit next to this, on the stump of a tree, all the way up to something like a puka, which can be sort of a giant horse or rabbit, a shapeshifter. You have giant dogs with glowing eyes that some believe are also part of that fairy kingdom, and they run the spectrum. And as one of your listeners commented, and that is 100% my belief, and part of the reason that I wanted to write this book, is that I do think people think of fairies and they have a very Disneyfied idea of what a fairy is. And this goes double for mermaids, right? But in reality, you have things that pinch you, things that steal, things that drag you along the midnight road, and dangle you over cliffs, and leave you gasping for breath. So there's quite a range, and many, many fairies are very tricky. Now, not all are like that, and there are certainly more benevolent ones that like to look after, especially domestic animals or children, and will act as guardians. And there are, of course, nature spirits that look over your garden. There are nature fairies, but they're all somewhat vengeful, and you have to treat them with respect. So that's something that's often missing, is the idea that you would leave an offering, or you leave something and give something to the fairy kingdom, just as you would leave an offering in any altar, and that this was a way to ensure that they would look after you. But there's all kinds of wonderfully morbid stories in fairy history, including something I love. In Ireland, they're frequently referred to as the good people. And in a lot of the older stories, and you can look in, like William Butler Yeats has this giant collection of fairy and folk tales. And, you take it all with a grain of salt, because he was an educated man of the, a certain era, writing these things down. But he traveled and he gathered these stories. And there's just some fantastic ones. T. Crofton Croker is another one who gathered a lot of stories. And they'll refer to these fairies as the good folk, and it's almost as if you're saying it to make sure that they don't do anything to you. Because I read a story just a couple weeks ago I had never read before, and it was about this man who came out of his house. Well, actually, what happened is he was told not to walk the road at midnight, and he was kind of, was like a 17-year-old or something. And so he did it anyway. And although he was warned to not do it, he did it anyway in defiance of his father. And sure, and what happened is the good folk came out, and they approached him alongside the road, and they were carrying a corpse. And this entire story takes place of this kid basically having to take this corpse around all of these different churchyards and bury it, and the corpse kind of directing him. All the while, the good folk are and they were constantly referred to as the good folk, are following him and snickering and waiting to see if he meets the task. And finally, it's very, as dawn is breaking, he finds a empty plot, because he keeps digging down, and the corpses are saying, "Hey, leave me alone." So corpses are talking, one of them's pointing, he's carrying this like heavy body, and eventually he buries it in the right churchyard and then goes rushing home. And the moral of the story is, don't defy your father when he tells you not to walk down the road at midnight. And it's just this fantastically morbid tale in which the entire time the fairies are referred to as the good folk, even though they're forcing him to, they're terrorizing him by making him carry a corpse.
So can the fairies just appear anywhere, or are there certain areas in the world where they appear?
I think that they can. I think there's certain areas in the world, but around the world, and they can appear to specific people, just like some people can see ghosts. But there are certainly places where fairies are more likely to be seen or more likely to inhabit. And Iceland is a wonderful example. There are places in Iceland that are known as fairy, Ireland, the whole of UK in general, but Iceland, they're known for putting roads around what is thought to be a fairy mound, or where a famous fairy tree or witch's tree grows. You have that throughout Ireland. Typically, you find either a formation of some kind of rocks. There's the fairy circles, so a fairy mound, which a fairy circle is often, it can be a circle of stones, it can be a circle of mushrooms, it can be a circle of flowers that grow. sometimes in a little mound or a glen. And then, of course, if you're looking for something more along the lines of a sort of like a water spirit or a fairy that protects, there's often fairy wells. So I have water that I've gathered from fairy wells throughout the UK that I use occasionally if I'm just, feeling not need that a little added connection to the fairy kingdom. And I love it because when you go somewhere like Ireland, you very well may have people who are attending church on Sunday, but they're stopping by the fairy well on Saturday afternoon and, using a little of the water and leaving a few coins as an offering. So it's not necessarily seen in conflict with, religion specifically.
Now, do they like the coins as offering, or would they rather have something else? I mean, what are they going to do with coins, right?
So fairies do like shiny things, but a lot of the fairies that live around people and live in people's houses, and you'll see examples of this. And I've had people call me and tell me about times when they had what they called so some people call them hobgoblins. A lot of people out there might be familiar with the Dobby, who was like the house elf in Harry Potter that was attached to the family. There's also the Dobie. So she didn't just make that up. The Dobie is actually a Welsh word for fairies. And you also have the brownies and goblins. And these are sort of the domestic fairies. They like cake, wine, ale, a nice offering of a plate. So you can leave things like that for them, and they'll help keep your house in order and help you find missing things, which they are likely to have been the ones that have taken the keys and the extra earring and things like that. But it's very interesting to me when I was researching that book, my Fairies, Pookas, and Changeling books, is that I kept seeing all of these parallels with, there's a lot of sightings or a lot of reports of like poltergeists and how poltergeists will like scratch you and you'll wake up with like bruises and people suspect that it's a poltergeist. And there are actually quite a few old stories of fairies that would do that if you sort of crossed them. So I'm not saying one or the other is more accurate, but I found some interesting parallels as I did with the sort of missing time and space that you see in alien abduction stories as well. There's some kind of thing going on with fairy and fairy time. It's quite different from our regular 24-hour clock.
Do you think that they have high technology?
I think they have old technology, which is probably the highest technology of them all.
Yeah, that's the truth, isn't it? Like these UFOs we see flying around are really piloted by, the Fae.
Yeah, that'd be so great, right?
Yeah. It was them. They built the pyramids. It was all the Fae.
But you do. It does make you wonder when you learn about, because I'm a folklorist and a supernaturalist at heart, but it does often cross my mind, not that people aren't having these experiences in modern times, but that people have been calling them different things. And we're sort of retelling the stories in a way that makes sense for our culture now versus 300 years ago in a little village in Donegal.
Yeah. Magnus says they don't build roads through certain rocks on Iceland.
Yeah. There's Iceland has a wonderful, wonderful, rich history of fairy and folklore, and there's quite a few diversions that have taken place when there's been a construction or plans. And they also have this wonderful tradition of these Christmas trolls. And the Christmas trolls are basically the mischievous sons of this witch that lives in one of the most famous mountains in Iceland that's thought to be a fairy kingdom, or a fairy portal. And again, you will see terms like trolls and witches and fairies quite interchangeable in a lot of the lore. And I owe a lot of that, in my mind, a lot of that comes to the fact that things are lost in translation. So you have Gaelic, but you have Welsh Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, you have Icelandic, you have the Norse languages mixing with the Latin languages, and people trying to explain what things are. Plus, you add in, that sort of inherent bias that comes with retelling a story to your own loved ones around the campfire. You're going to make it relatable to them, or you're going to put your own slant on it. And another thing and I think you see this frequently with collections about werewolves and mermaids and fairies and pagan kind of lore in general, is that you do have, for the written record and what we have sort of in the English language, you have quite a bit of literature that was produced from the mid 1800s through the mid 1900s, frequently written by men of the cloth, because they were men who were educated and could read and write and had the leisure time to travel from town to town, and frequently were converting, but also tended to be people who were naturally interested in cultures and what other people were doing. So while they did us a service by recording what they saw, there was also the disservice of the, that sort of slant of the world view of the, monotheistic one God kind of view. And that a lot of times you'll see morals and the devil introduced in places that maybe wasn't there prior. So you have to sift through all of that when you're reading. And then, there's also just some things that are just told to teach a lesson, or, keep kids out of the bog from slipping into the into the waters.
All right. Well, we're getting quite a few people jumping in here now. Akram says, you are early today. Hello, by the way. And Jackie's here. How you doing, Jackie? Make sure you hit that like button, everybody, because it just helps with the algorithm and helps the video get out there so that everybody can get in here. We're actually a little early today, but we are a day late, so we're technically late, if that makes any sense. We're early but late at the same time. We're an hour early and a day late, so that's where we are today. But we're doing a show, and we've got Varla Ventura with us. And Varla, I wanted to ask you, is there anything that people can do to bring fairies to you? Like if I have a house and I've got a garden out back, could I build my own little mound and put like little stuff out there for them, and or does that not work?
Most definitely. I think that's a wonderful way to go about it. Fairies like a habitat not unlike pollinators. So I usually try and make some kind of little shelter, some place where I can leave little things. I mean, my son and I frequently have a section of our garden that's dedicated to fairies, of course. Some people have a way that they can leave correspondence, but I think the idea is really just kind of dedicating it as a sacred space, as you would with anything that really you're trying to put some reverence into. And whenever I think, I don't know, is this really doing anything? I am reminded of the Findhorn, which was a community in the 1960s and 70s in Scotland that was basically this area that was incredibly difficult to grow anything there. It was limestone and craggy and rocks. And a group of people began to garden there and took up the practice of really sort of invoking the elementals and trying to work in relationship with the fairy kingdom. And as a result, they had thriving gardens. And there's a couple of books about this. In fact, one of the people who started it is the guy who eventually started Smith and Hawken, the sort of gardening supplies, Paul Hawkins. So I'm always just kind of reminded of that, and a little bit of that, well, what harm does it really do? Because you're also creating a little bit of a habitat for anything that could be really beneficial to your garden, including, frogs, butterflies, bees, pollinators, birds, things like that. So you're also kind of introducing that element to it, but you absolutely can. I know people who leave regular correspondence for the fairies or write things. You can find them in little, woody nooks. And when I walk around with my son, we point out, especially if we go for a hike in the woods, that could be, that looks like a fairy door. That looks like a fairy door. And you'll start seeing them after a while, little places that trees form that look like you could just stick a doorknob on it. And the other place that you can often find or that you can invite fairies is through water. So you can have a small fountain or a dish of water, or you can find, a brook or a well or something like that if you want to kind of commune with them.
Okay. So have you ever seen any?
I have. So I think I mentioned at the very beginning that when I was a kid, I had an experience that it took me until I was an adult to really believe that what I believed as a kid that I felt was still real. And I saw what I thought at the time was a leprechaun, but what was confusing about it is that it didn't fit what we think of, many of us think of as a leprechaun. He didn't have a little hat. He didn't have a little belt. He didn't have a little green coat. He was a little sort of sinewy, kind of man-like creature that was under a very large, we called it an umbrella plant. So it was just a very large leaf. And he was sitting on the other side of this little brook, and I was down there by myself. And I looked over, and it was one of those, he looked at me, I looked at him, and then I immediately yelled for my mom and my sister because I wanted them to see it. And and of course, the second, and then when I turned back, all that was left was this sort of leaf moving as if something had darted away very quickly. But what confused me about it at the time was that it didn't look like I thought, well, is that a leprechaun? It looked like a little man, but it didn't fit any of the descriptions that in my mind was what a leprechaun looked like. And interestingly, a few years ago, when I started researching the fairy book, I found a whole old book about leprechauns, something that had been, I think it had been published in maybe the late 1700s. And it was talking about the way that these leprechauns looked. And then later I found something in William Butler Yeats's book about describing leprechauns. And it wasn't at all how we think. It wasn't the Lucky Charms guy at all. It was usually that they frequently were in other colors, not necessarily green. There was not always a hat associated. You'd often see them in sort of somewhat tattered clothes. They're sort of the bachelors of the fairy kingdom, and they're kind of like to keep to themselves. And they, frequently there isn't necessarily a whole pot of gold, but there's often a magic purse that has gold in it. All of these things that kind of shattered my, whatever childlike image of what a leprechaun was. And the more I read these descriptions, the more I thought that that's really what I actually saw. So,
have you seen any since you started writing? Since you wrote the book, have they like come to you like, how dare you write this about us? Or
well, I did lose an entire chapter, and I owe that to the hobgoblins. I was under deadline, and I actually was over deadline, I should say, and I was probably about 2 days late and just down to the wire, and it was 2 a.m, and I had saved my and I had the thing is the fairies all kind of connect. So I was sort of getting lost in this rabbit hole of where do I put this section? Because this actually reminds me of, does this go in the domestic fairies or the woodland fairies? And, I was just in that like spiral of sweat right before you have to send something to your publisher and kind of freaking out. So I thought, okay, I need to just take a break. So I saved my document. I went to bed. I came back the next day, and I could not find this particular chapter. Now, I may well have just accidentally deleted it in my, fury. But the way that I work is that I save each chapter that I work on as a chapter, and then I put it into the manuscript. So I couldn't find it anywhere, and it was the chapter about the hobgoblins, and it was specifically about how they like to trick you and frequently are the ones that are responsible for taking things from your house. So I just said, all right, you win. You can have it. obviously whatever I wrote was a misrepresentation, and I'm going to go back to it. And so I got, a week extension, and I rewrote that section as best I could from memory, and then, found a couple of sources and tried to kind of cobble it together again in a better way. And I personally have had a lot of paranormal experiences. I've seen quite a few ghosts. I've felt quite a few things. But in my own, I've had more corner of the eye stuff since I wrote the fairy book. But I also have been pretty conscious of making sure that I'm acknowledging them. But I have had actually quite a bit of abundance and good luck in some of the areas that I've specifically asked for, not necessarily in book sales, but in other aspects of my life. And my garden is utterly beautiful. So
do you think they have to be in a certain location to switch dimensions or parallel universes? Or if you see one, could you grab it and like put it in like a dog cage or something?
Okay, that is like the mistake that everyone makes in all of the old fairy stories is they try, especially the leprechaun stories, they try and grab them. That is like always going to be your fatal mistake. Never try and grab a fairy. Now, children in particular do well with fairies as they do with ghosts because their instinct isn't necessarily to grab it, but sort of treat it a little more matter-of-factly and have a conversation with it. But again, as adults, there's frequently the let's trap it, let's get it to tell us its secrets, let's get it to tell us where it's hiding its gold. And leprechauns in particular are horribly mistreated in a lot of the fairy stories. The leprechauns are trapped, they're tied down with ropes, they're threatened instead of, it's always just like, you could have just asked nicely. But leprechauns also typically outsmart any kind of protagonist in any of the stories. So I don't think you really want to set out with the mindset that you're trying to trap them. What you're really trying to do is converse with them, ask them questions. You have to ask yourself, what do you want out of it? Are you just looking for proof so you can say, hey, these are real? Are you looking for a sign to show you that you're on the right path and that you're doing something that you're supposed to be doing? Are you looking for a warning? Why are you trying to connect with these otherworldly beings? I firmly believe that although people frequently will have these encounters when they're least expecting them, that they mean something, whether it's a ghostly sighting or another kind of supernatural being, or something galloping alongside your car at night. There's usually a reason that you're seeing those things. That reason is not always apparent immediately, but it might be clear later. So I think you can probably have a bit of a conversation. Now, most people that I know that have had sightings or have sent me any kind of pictures haven't had a whole ongoing relationship. They have a brief sighting. But there are some people who practice deep fairy magic and do claim to have had the same fairies revisit them and had discussions with them. So I think that's possible. I personally haven't had that experience, but I'm going to guess my mom has.
Sounds like you need to get out there more, right? Now, Tony says he once saw a bright light in the shape of a human in the forest. Could that be a fairy?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's sort of an ethereal fairy light that people do see, and that's across all kinds of literature where you'll see a light. In fact, I think there's a lot of things that people see in the woods that they think might be, something more Bigfoot-like that could probably be put in that fairy kingdom.
Could you put Bigfoot in the fairy realm?
I probably would. I think Bigfoot people wouldn't, but I probably would. I do. I put him in the same world.
They're all from the same place, right?
That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So do I.
Yeah.
I do too. So Apex is here. Thanks for joining us today. I noticed he was late. Apex usually joins us for every show, but he was late today, so I just want to point out that he was late. And Jackie says, I was at the Gosford Glyphs in NSW, whatever that means, and heard eerie chanting off in the forest. And before I entered the forest, I'd left tobacco and granola at the entrance. So they chant a lot, right?
So fairies make all kinds of noises. For example, we talked about the banshee, but you also have mermaids that will chant. Now, that might surprise people that mermaids fall into the fairy kingdom, but the Irish certainly classified them as water fairies, and they were known as the Merrow, and are part of the kingdom of the fairy. And they make sounds and songs. Fairies do frequently sing. That whole idea of the dwarves sort of chanting as they're going down to work in the mines is based on old Welsh stories of hearing songs down in the mines. So absolutely. And I think that that's a way that people have that experience and are kind of reminded, but they aren't necessarily able to see it because it's coming from some other place outside of outside of your immediate whatever's right in front of you. Maybe it's behind you, and there's this kind of elusiveness that I absolutely love. The elusiveness of the fairy kingdom. I love that you can't just like trap one. I mean, it's and that maybe that's why I think Bigfoot goes in that category, because if you could just like shoot it and put it on your wall, then, okay, great. You've got the trophy to prove it, but what have you really done? And I love that the fairies kind of constantly mess with our idea of what's real and what's not real. Something I think we all need more of, really, especially since we spend so much time on the internet.
Well, you mean we need more of the confusion between what's real and what's not real?
I think we need more of the defiance of always trying to have that proof and that evidence and not being able to quite get our fingers on it. I mean, I firmly believe that we not only do we tell fairy tales and we tell these kind of stories for there's a variety of reasons. We tell them to retell our experiences. We tell them to keep the children closer to the fire. We tell them to bond. But one of the reasons that we tell stories and we need these stories and we need this what if is because if everything was laid out in front of you on the table, you'd have everything laid out on the table in front of you, and you would never think outside the box because everything would be in the box with you. It's like Plato's allegory of the cave, where you have people who are chained to the wall, and there's sort of these shadows behind them that are the people making these shadows that are casting what they think of as the whole world, as if they're looking at a television. And one of them breaks free, runs out into the real world, can't believe the sky is blue and there's so much happening, runs back into the cave, and the people in the cave don't believe him because they're trained to see only what's in front of them. That is limited thinking. And when you have limited thinking, you can't invent things, right? And we're not just talking about inventing fantastical stories. We're talking about inventing, medicine and, amazing new ways to travel through space and, the cure
news
for
stories.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of things. And so you have to have that out of the box thinking. And I think that that's why, regardless of whether or not you fully buy into the idea of this other world or not, you have to see the value in that way of thinking of a world that is intangible, and how important that is to freeing your mind. And even if I'm telling you a story about a leprechaun, even if during that time, you're even for a moment, if you're just lost in the story and the art of the storytelling, then you have actually suspended your doubt just for a little bit. And when you suspend doubt, then you can actually operate on with more of an open mind. Because
that's
just
the
for a
trick,
second,
right?
you'd stop doubting, right?
That's the trick. You just got to have an open mind about things. And Lee Palace wants to know, as far as the singing fairies go, is there any connection to the sirens of Greek mythology?
Yes. Now, there's a lot of people actually mix up mermaids and sirens, and they do actually kind of can be interchangeable. And of course, as Greek mythology really merged into the rest of Europe, and especially into kind of mixed in with Celtic mythology, we had a lot of overlap in those stories. But sirens are very similar in that they sing a song, they can guide you or take you away from a cliff. They're frequently seen near the sea, but they're often half bird and half woman, or they have the voice of a beautiful woman. Whereas mermaids are usually fish and human, or a hybrid of something that looks human and is fish. And they are frequently, mermaids might be some of the most revered and misunderstood of the magical creatures, and they are both loved by more people, and also more people are not willing to admit they believe in them. So it's like once you get past the age of 12, no one wants to admit that they're real until, you do meet some people. So when I was working on that book, that was very interesting. I always like to welcome stories that people and experiences that people have had. And mermaids are very interesting. They're misunderstood. We certainly have this idea that they're beautiful and, have these lovely voices. And we're kind of all taught the story of the Little Mermaid who trades her voice, although in the original story, she actually, kind of trades a lot more than just her voice in order to be with this prince. But there are many, many other stories in which the mermaids are quite lovely, but they're also not necessarily always female. They frequently look very jagged. They are often sort of there to trick you, and almost in an innocent-like way. Oh, you can't breathe underwater? Oh, come with me. There's quite a few stories of a man walking along the beach, and there's a mermaid sort of trapped in a tide pool, and she convinces him to help her go just a little bit deeper, just a little further out until the tide starts to carry them out. But you also have mermaids as psychopomps, which are the guardians that kind of cross you over into the other world. And so while some people believe that mermaids can cause storms and cause death, many, many sailors believe that mermaids can actually guide you away from treachery. And there are countless stories of fishermen being sort of guided away from drifting out to sea back toward safe harbor. And then there's also the psychopomp idea of them actually taking the souls of someone who's drowned at sea and carrying it to the sort of watery grave below and sort of tending that soul. And rather than having it just be wandering and lost at sea, that mermaids actually serve that purpose. So there's quite a range there.
Yeah, I saw.
I think talk about mermaids, so yeah, you gotta get that in there.
Oh, mermaids are definitely interesting. I saw a National Geographic special, I think it was, or maybe it was on the History Channel or something, where they were showing these videos and pictures of these mermaids that they were actually capturing today. Like one of them got caught in a net. I don't know if you've seen any of these.
Well, there were a couple of mockumentaries that came out several years ago that were showing, basically it looked very much like a documentary, and they were sort of retelling a lot of the mermaid legends. And ironically, that was when I was working on my mermaid book, and they looked very, very real. So I'm not sure if that's what it was on, it was on Animal Planet or something too. So it really threw people off because it only said at the very beginning that it was a mockumentary. So if you came into it halfway, it was produced exactly like you were watching a thing about sharks. But what I loved about it is that it went through a lot of the legends and stories, like there's this bay in Israel where basically there's a standing reward for anyone who can provide evidence of the mermaid that they believe lives in the waters. It's like $1,000 reward or something. You just have to prove it and bring some tangible evidence. And in that mockumentary, they actually kind of talked about that particular place. I think there was a sighting there. So I'm not sure if that's what you've seen. I haven't really
probably. I probably didn't see the very beginning.
I mean, that was the thing about it. It actually made some people really, really mad because it didn't say it at the very beginning. And then it was hilarious because, see, I always get the name of the organization wrong, but it's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association or something like that, NOAA. And they're the ones who track the bloop in the sea and sort of, underwater, the earthquakes and things like that. And after that came out, they actually were like, they interview scientists from there, and this Noah had to like come out and make, they actually made a public statement that they did not believe that mermaids were real. And I just thought, oh my God, you just dashed the hopes of so many. Like, why'd you have to make that declaration? I mean, just own it a little bit longer.
Well, if we think, we'll create it with our mind, right?
Well, I have actually had more than one person tell me stories about being people who have lived at sea or lived on sailboats or lived near the ocean, or lived on an island, who have told me stories of not only just like their own, whatever their cultural beliefs are about mermaids, but also actual experiences, including sounds that guided them back into harbor and things like that. So you have beautiful, stories of leaving offerings to mermaids and them, rewarding sailors with calm seas and abundant catches. The other kind of interesting thing about mermaids that's kind of more along the scientific lines is that, a lot of people think that manatees or dugongs, which are the equivalent of a manatee in the southern hemisphere, now they're rather bodacious, and they have these tails that flare out in this certain way. And so some people believe that early mermaid sightings, as sailors were coming over, they were seeing these creatures they'd never seen before, but they had heard all these tales of mermaids through legend. We're talking about people sailing from from Spain, and pirates coming from England and Ireland. And so you had these creatures that you're like, wait, what was that, a mermaid? Then, of course, you have to add in the idea of being at sea for a very long time and probably somewhat nutrient deprived among being deprived of other things. So, yeah, that could definitely look like a mermaid. But something that I think is very interesting, and it is said that Blackbeard himself would not let his sailors, there were certain places on the map that he marked as mermaid infested waters, and he wouldn't want to sail through those because he was worried that they would enchant his crew and the crew would go overboard. But if you know anything about manatees or dugongs, you know that they live in very shallow waters. And so if you were to bring your boat on shallow waters, you would potentially, you'd run aground and then you'd be totally stuck. So in some of these instances where you have mermaid infested waters, it kind of did two things. It prevented people from sailing there because they were afraid of mermaids, but it also kept you from going into these areas that you might actually wreck. So
all right,
who knows?
All right. Well, I'm getting behind on some of these questions, I suppose. They're flying in now. Hugh wants to know, do the fairies or mermaids bite?
Oh, yes, certainly. There's impish ones that bite and pinch, most frequently the domestic fairies. And I think I had mentioned earlier there's some connection with, I think there's a connection with what we might think of as poltergeist, where children or teenagers in particular might wake up with scratches or marks. There's quite a few stories of lazy people being lazy about keeping their kitchen clean and or keeping their rooms clean and sort of being pinched or lightly whipped in the night. And mermaids themselves definitely have a tendency toward, causing drownings, death. I don't know too much about biting other than the fact that they have been depicted as having some pretty intense teeth. Now, the mermen, frequently are described as having like a set of very jagged and very sharp teeth.
Yeah, well, maybe it's because they don't brush them.
Yeah, maybe they just don't take care. There's
there's
one
no
of them and 20 mermaids,
there's
so
no merman dentist, right?
they're they're at the they're at the mercy. Yeah.
Antonio says, has Varla seen the YouTube vid of the fairy-like creature coming out of that tree hive type thing in the garden?
So, okay, I'm not sure exactly which one Antonio is referring to, but I have seen quite a few fairy is if he's there's one I saw recently where there's like a dad and some kids in the backyard and this thing comes flying out and they're just like they actually get really freaked out. And then there's another one that I saw recently where this thing kind of seems like it has sort of long legs, but I don't know if you've heard about like this big cicada like explosion that's happening this year in particular in the United States.
Yeah, I have heard that. Yeah.
So I was kind of reading about that the other day just because it was interesting. And if you get real close in some of those pictures, some of those cicadas actually look like they have like long, weird, dangly legs. So I'm not a skeptic. I'm actually a very open-minded, but when it comes to videos that I see online, I have a very hard time believing them because it's so easy to doctor things.
Yeah, Antonio says yes, that's it.
Yeah, the backyard one, it's like I think it's like an English dad or something, and they're like his kids are in that one actually seemed the most realistic to me because it really did genuinely seem like the dad was just videoing his kids and then this thing came out. There was another one I saw and it might have just a friend of mine whose show I've been on a few times sent me some, and one that I thought was really realistic was this one that was through like a security cam. So it was like not a Nest or what's that thing, the Ring, and it wasn't really there wasn't anything in particular around this. It was like on someone's porch, and basically there was this kind of flare up and there were all of these little twinkling lights, and then it kind of disappeared and then it came back, and there weren't any people around at the time. Now I've seen fireflies and things like that, but just there was something about the way that this kind of appeared. It was just a little bit more of a head scratcher for me. Like, I don't know, I suppose someone could have thrown glitter from the side. I mean, you could get pretty elaborate if you were trying to fake these things, but there's been a couple of those that are more convincing, but I always kind of, I don't know, some of those internet videos are.
Yeah, I haven't seen that video, so Antonio, if you can find it and leave it in the comments section, I'll check it out later. And Jar of Sacred Hearts says, I had fairies leave me messages on how to write characters for my book. Is this common to help humans tell stories?
Well, there is a long-standing relationship with the arts and fairies, and writers in particular, especially in places like Ireland where writers and poets are revered, possibly why William Butler Yeats had such a relationship with them, that there's that sort of muse kind of relationship, and also with people who are painters or like to sit and draw. But I think that's wonderful, and congratulations, because that takes some work. It also takes work to write, and it's really I wouldn't say it's common. I would say there's an old tradition of a relationship between the storyteller and the fairy kingdom, and fairies will reward writers and storytellers, but I would not say that's common. So I think you should feel very, very special.
Yeah, Jar of Sacred Hearts also says,
awesome.
He says they also left me pictures of sacred geometry and trees with cutouts.
Whoa, that's pretty cool.
Now, do you get a lot of sacred geometry, or I guess that geometry? I mean, you hear a lot about it, right? When it comes to different parallel things and different dimensions and stuff. What's with the sacred geometry and the fairy world?
Well, there's certainly quite a bit of sacred geometry in the natural world. You have things like the Fibonacci sequence inside sunflowers, and certain shells will have this kind of pattern in them. But I think it probably just kind of comes down to the idea of like, I always think of places where you can find fairies are also ley lines, and those are those places those where magical grids cross on the earth, and many churches are built on top of ley lines, which is why people can have very profound and sacred experiences in those places. Frequently churches were built on top of sacred ruins or other ruins where, you know, early people knew there was something energetically there. And I think that all kind of matches in with the idea of sacred geometry, and that these patterns that kind of connect us together as people and the natural world and the planet itself.
All right, and just want to give a shout out to Mr. Fox is here, and Chuck Bam is here. Alien Girl has come in. They're all screaming that we're early. Yeah, we're early, but we're a day late, so we're still a little late. Alien Girl says she loves fairies. Really excited to hear this show. So, I guess have they ever tried to tell us anything? Is there like an ambassador or something that's trying to tell us something? Like, do they need anything, or it's perhaps like the ley lines? Yeah, you know, like the ley lines could be like a frequency grid or something, and maybe it's losing power. That's why they're kind of fading and into nothingness. Do they need our help with anything?
I mean, I think you could probably make a lot of connections to say like there's this, you know, this greater message. But I think on an individual basis, and traditionally, fairies are here mostly to teach us individual lessons in our lives. So, for example, take the Pooka. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, a Pooka is a shape-shifting fairy. You will occasionally hear people refer to any kind of fairy as a Pooka, especially in Ireland. Sometimes you'll hear the word Pooka meaning any type of fairy. But I'm talking about the shape-shifting, can appear as a horse, can appear as a rabbit, sometimes as an eagle or a dog, but most frequently, it's a horse. And this Pooka typically appears at midnight or after midnight, usually when you're alone, and it preys on drunks. So you will often see a Pooka or read a Pooka story about, Danny O'Toole walking home too late from the pub and walking a little too close to the cliff. And this Pooka sort of appears out of nowhere and terrifies him, knocks him over, puts him on the back of the horse, takes him on this terrifying ride, running close to cliffs, and then drops him off in a ditch. And he wakes up. Sure, this could be this great story that no one's going to believe. They think he just had one too many. But in fact, there is this terror that was instilled in him, and it's a way to set yourself on the right path again. So you see stories like that where the fairies appear, and they appear for a very specific reason. I think like anything in the natural world and any kind of creature, animal, plant, or otherwise, if we think of fairies in that way, the way we think of the plant kingdom or the way we think of the animal kingdom, then they need our help in that, we're like dumping toxic chemicals into their meadows, right? So there's always going to be a stronger relationship with the kingdom of the fairy if we are taking care of the planet that we live in and nurturing those kind of like places where there are those portals. Interestingly, quite a few mermaids, modern day mermaids, are ocean crusaders. So there's a absolute group of people, men and women, who perform as mermaids. They wear mermaid tails. They, perform in shows, but they also raise money and awareness to clean the oceans. So you have these kind of things where, life actually imitates the story or the art in that way. But I think probably more than anything, these fairies really exist for us to kind of get you had the person who said that she got characters, or that they got characters from the fairies. I think it's just a reminder that we're not the only ones here, and there's plenty left to learn, and there's plenty of mystery left in the world. And it can be very romanticized, right? You go back, hundreds of years, and you imagine yourself this like Celtic goddess, and you're just kind of like roaming around picking herbs. And yes, of course, we can get lost in this fantasy. That life was also very hard then, and there were a lot of unidentified diseases that were, took children and things like that. So we certainly have come a long way. But I think that I don't know if there's like one great message. I'm not, I think I probably mentioned I'm not particularly religious, so I have a hard time believing in just one message. I think it's much more kind of personal and individual, but the greater message maybe just being that, there is something out there. There's something sacred out there.
Well, if they were in another dimension, I mean, their world wouldn't be polluted by us, right?
Yeah, but see, I don't really think so. That I guess that's where I don't really think it's another dimension, as in it's like completely sort of. It's not quite parallel. Like I think there are portals, and there's another world, and they're able to kind of go in and out of our like whatever limited sight we have, but I don't think it's necessarily like a completely ephemeral, non-existent parallel dimension. I mean, I think parallel dimensions, you can totally mess with everything if you start messing with one of them. But also, I think if you look back at the idea of kind of passing into these caves or into this other world, you really get into the world of the underworld and the world of like the passage into the next world. And that is more of like an invisible, I mean, I don't know if parallel dimension is the right term, because that is sort of like the invisible to us that coexists with us. So I find it kind of hard to define. I mean, I don't really think it's definable, honestly. I think it defies our sense of linear time and space, and we want to quantify it, and we want to say what it is, and we want to say you open this door and you just like end up in this other place, but it's like constant glitches, and you can't really quantify it because it defies our regular view of linear time and space, which is great.
Do you think it's possible that they're there all the time, that it's not
Watching
interdimensional, that we just can't see them because we're only using like a little bit of our brain, like our brains aren't capable of seeing them?
Yes, I probably believe that more than anything, really, because it definitely, I mean, it certainly feels like that to me at times, and anyone who's spent much time alone in the woods can probably agree with that. Or even out on a lake or out at sea, there's times when it feels like you're completely, being watched, right?
Yeah. Ron wants to know, where are fairies most prominent at?
So there's fairies in different, I mean, you have woodland fairies, right? You can have like some domestic and garden fairies. I would say they're probably most common in some of the more untouched spaces. So if you have like a large tract of woods that's relatively untouched, or kind of a large natural area or park, you probably more likely. I mean, you see a lot of them in the woods, but they really can be anywhere. They can be at sea. They can be, there's ones in the desert. There's all kinds of places where you can encounter them. But I feel like woods are probably your best bet. Woods near like a babbling brook, that feels like pretty likely.
It's kind of untouched, sitting out there, not being bothered by anything, really.
Yeah.
All right. Well, there you go, Ron. Jar of Sacred Heart says, pray to the elementals and they will help you with anything, but you have to help planet Earth by picking up trash on your way. Then you see the magic of the fairies. Remember that.
That's beautiful.
And Hugh says, I eat magic mushrooms every September, so I guess I've seen lots of strange things. Now, that's a good question, though, right? I mean, we could put that in there as a question. Does doing mushrooms or things of that nature help you see this world?
I think so. I think that that's traditionally you will have many cultures that will imbibe in something, whether it's, something like kava or a hallucinogenic root or mushrooms. Of course, you have that connection with witches and magic and being able to kind of see through other dimensions. And that is the purpose of a lot of these plants and substances, is to kind of give us that transformative mindset. And that's certainly where their role lies traditionally, in a sacred way, to give us that other kind of that just let those barriers down and allow us to see things that are there or not there, but we can't see them with our normal blockers on. So certainly those things can enhance, and especially for people who have difficulty seeing them. Some people don't need that, and many people can put themselves into trance or a meditative state or into the frame of mind with no substances. So I've certainly seen things that aren't fairies.
Do you think that they have souls, that they can astral travel or things like that outside of their bodies, or are they limited to their bodies?
I don't know if they need to do that. I think they just kind of do their thing. I think we're the ones that are more limited by our domestic bodies and minds.
Yeah.
They've already got that mastered, right?
Yeah, that's probably a good answer there. And Ron also wants to know, are there forbidden places for fairies? Like, could I set up a fairy free zone?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never had anyone ask me how to not have a fairy. I mean, there's certainly ways that you can banish fairies, and there's quite a few old remedies for keeping fairies out of your house, especially if during childbirth and things like that. And it usually involves making sure every little door and cupboard is locked. So I'm sure we could dig up some anti-fairy sprays, but yeah, I mean, I've never tried to do that before, but I think with anything, you probably use a little salt and and keep your doors and windows locked. Now there are certainly ways that you can avoid being inducted into the fairy kingdom. So my mom used to always say, don't step on a fairy mound, don't sit in a fairy mound. You're very vulnerable as a child to be, caught on a fairy mound, because the idea was that if you fell asleep on a fairy mound, you might wake up in the fairy kingdom, and it's very easy to get tricked into thinking that, you're only there for a couple days and you should stay and you should eat and drink and play and marry and make merry and dance. And then, in fact, years go by and you've been missing. So I'm sure there's far more preventative. I think, Lady Olivia Wilde has a few old books that you could look and see if you can find any anti-fairy remedies.
So, don't step on a fairy mound. How would you describe a fairy mound so people don't step on it?
Usually, well, as was pointed out to me as a child, it's usually a place in the forest where a circle of mushrooms grow, but sometimes can be a circle of flowers or a circle of stones. It can also just be a place that looks a little different. So it might rise up from the earth and just kind of look a little different, look like it just kind of gives you a feeling like, hey, that might be a special place. Let's not have our picnic there, right? Let's sit over here in the trampled grass. So that's how I was taught to identify them. And to this day, if I see something like that, I step around it.
All right. Well, that's a good thing for people to look for. Maybe you can, if you find something like that, leave an offering there. Something shiny, I suppose, right?
Yeah, something shiny or something delicious.
Delicious. Or tobacco. Do they like tobacco?
Definitely something biodegradable.
So you don't want to leave a flask for them.
No, but you could certainly, leave a leaf full of whiskey or something.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. All right. Well, Varla, you want to tell everybody where they can find you, and I suppose we'll wrap up for today.
Yeah, so you can visit me. I have a website, varlaventura.net, and you can find out more about the books that I've written and radio appearances such as this and other kind of fun things. And then I'm on all the social things, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And just if you just search my name, it's just Varla Ventura. You'll find me there.
All right, and the link to your website will be in the description box below. Remember, everybody, you can always follow us online. Just go to www.conflictradio.net. You can find us on all of your normal podcast catchers, including Apple iTunes, iHeart Podcasts, wherever you catch a podcast, we're probably there. Just look for us. And if you're listening to us on Apple iTunes, go ahead and rate us and leave us a review. I noticed we're getting a lot of listeners, but not too many reviews on there. So go ahead and leave us a review. Well, I guess we'll be back on Thursday. Remember, batten down the hatches and be safe.